I saw him kiss her beneath the chandelier, and the world fell silent around me. The orchestra continued to play, the dancers continued to turn in their jeweled gowns and tailcoats. But all I could hear was the sound of my own heart breaking, slow and deliberate, like ice cracking across a frozen lake. 3 years I had been the Duchess of Ravensmoor, and in all that time, my husband had never once looked at me the way he looked at Lady Vivienne Harcourt in that moment. His hand was at the small of her back, his head bent toward hers, with a tenderness I did not know he possessed. And when their lips met, I understood with perfect clarity that I had been living a lie. I had married a man who did not love me, who perhaps could not love me, and I had spent 3 years convincing myself that duty and respect might one day grow into something warmer. But duty does not kiss another woman at a ball while your wife stands 20 feet away, holding a glass of champagne she can no longer taste. I did not scream. I did not faint. I did not throw my glass or cause the scene that every woman in that ballroom would have understood and perhaps forgiven. Instead, I set my champagne on the nearest table, turned, and walked through the French doors into the garden, where the summer night wrapped around me like a shroud. The air smelled of roses and rain, and somewhere in the darkness, I could hear the fountain splashing in its eternal, indifferent rhythm. My hands were shaking so badly I had to clasp them together, and even then I could feel the tremor running through my entire body, as though I might shatter if I moved too quickly. I had known, of course. Some part of me had always known. From the very beginning, from the day my father told me I was to marry the Duke of Ravensmoor to save our family from ruin, I had known that I was not wanted. My father's estates were drowning in debt, his name tarnished by years of poor decisions and expensive vices, and the Duke had offered a solution that was both generous and devastating. He would marry me, absorb our debts, and restore my family's standing in society. In exchange, he would gain a duchess of appropriate breeding and a connection to a family that, despite its recent troubles, still carried one of the oldest titles in England. It had been a transaction, pure and simple, and I had accepted it because I had no choice. At 19, I was old enough to understand that women of my class did not marry for love, and young enough to still hope that affection might bloom where passion could not. But the Duke of Ravensmoor was not a man who bloomed. He was winter itself, all sharp edges and cold silences, and our wedding night had been as formal and joyless as the ceremony that preceded it. He had performed his duty with the same efficiency he brought to managing his estates, and then he had retreated to his own chambers, where he had remained, night after night, for 3 years. I had tried, in the beginning, to reach him. I had arranged dinners, suggested walks through the estate gardens, asked about his work with the tenants and the management of his properties. He had been polite, always polite, answering my questions with the distant courtesy one might show a house guest who had overstayed her welcome. He never raised his voice, never showed anger or frustration, but his indifference was worse than any cruelty could have been. I was a ghost in my own home, invisible and insubstantial, and eventually I stopped trying to be seen. The castle itself became my prison and my refuge. Ravensmoor was a vast Gothic fortress perched on the cliffs of the northern coast, all grey stone and narrow windows, with corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity. The morning light barely penetrated the thick walls, and even in summer there was a chill that never quite left the rooms. It was beautiful in its own severe way, the kind of beauty that inspired awe rather than comfort, with vaulted ceilings that echoed every footstep and tapestries so old their colors had faded to shades of gray and brown. But it was also lonely, so achingly lonely that sometimes I would walk through the portrait gallery just to feel surrounded by faces, even if they were long dead and painted in oils. I studied those portraits obsessively in my first year of marriage, searching for some clue to understanding the man I had married. The Ravensmoor lineage stretched back centuries, each duke more stern and unyielding than the last, their painted eyes following me as I passed. There were duchesses too, of course. Women in elaborate gowns with pearls at their throats and expressions of quiet resignation. I wondered if they had been happy, if any of them had managed to crack the cold exterior of the men they had married, or if they had all simply learned, as I was learning, to find contentment in duty and acceptance in loneliness. My own routine became a kind of meditation on emptiness. I would wake at dawn, dress with the help of my maid Sarah, and take breakfast alone in the small dining room that overlooked the sea. The Duke took his meals in his study, or so I was told, though I had never seen him eat, and sometimes wondered if he sustained himself on paperwork and cold duty alone. After breakfast, I would spend an hour in the conservatory, tending to the flowers that seemed to be the only living things in the castle that responded to my care. The roses grew wild and fragrant under my attention, climbing the glass walls until they blocked out portions of the sky, and I found a strange comfort in their thorns, in the way they could be both beautiful and dangerous at once. In the afternoons, I read. The library at Ravensmoor was magnificent. 3 stories of books that smelled of leather and age, with rolling ladders and hidden alcoves where I could curl up and disappear into other people's lives. I read novels mostly, stories of women who made choices and had adventures, who loved passionately and suffered beautifully and always found some kind of resolution by the final page. I knew they were fantasies, these books, as removed from my reality as fairy tales, but they gave me something to hold on to. Some proof that feeling deeply was still possible, even if not for me. I took up watercolors too, though I had no particular talent for it. I would set up my easel by the windows and try to capture the way the light fell across the cliffs, the way the sea churned gray and white against the rocks below. My paintings were mediocre at best, all muddy colors and uncertain lines, but the act of creating something, anything, made me feel less like a ghost. I existed, I told myself, as I mixed pigments and dabbed at canvas. I was here, even if no one else seemed to notice, and I wrote letters to my sister Margaret, long rambling letters filled with lies about my happiness. I told her about the beauty of the castle, the kindness of the servants, the quiet dignity of my life as a duchess. I described imaginary dinner parties and walks with my husband, conversations we had never had about books and politics and the management of the estate. I painted a picture of a marriage that existed only in my imagination, and with each letter, I felt the distance between who I was and who I pretended to be growing wider and more unbridgeable. Margaret was 17 now, still at home with our parents, and I wanted desperately to protect her from the truth of what marriage could be. She wrote back with enthusiasm about her coming debut, about the young men she had met at local assemblies, about her hopes and dreams for her own future. She asked me for advice about love, about how to know if a man truly cared for you, and I found myself writing platitudes I did not believe, telling her to trust her heart and believe in the possibility of happiness. What else could I do? Tell her the truth? Tell her that marriage was often a cage dressed up as a castle, that love was a luxury most women of our class could never afford? The servants pitied me, I knew, though they were too well trained to show it openly. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, had been with the Duke's family for 30 years, and she had a way of appearing at my door with tea and biscuits exactly when I needed them most. She would sit with me for a few minutes, reporting on household matters that required no reporting at all, her presence a quiet kindness in the vast emptiness of my days. She had kind eyes, Mrs. Henderson, the sort of eyes that had seen too much sadness to judge anyone harshly, and sometimes when she looked at me, I felt seen in a way that made my throat tight with unshed tears. She had known the Duke as a boy, she told me once, back before his father died, and he inherited the title at the age of 20. He had been different then, she said, more open, quicker to smile. But something had changed him, some burden or grief that she would not name, and he had withdrawn into himself, becoming the cold, distant man I had married. She never elaborated, never gave me the details I craved, but her words haunted me. What could change a person so completely? What weight could be so heavy that it crushed all warmth and softness out of a human soul? I had asked him once, in our first month of marriage, why he seemed so sad. We had been in the library, one of the few times we had occupied the same room without the buffer of servants or social obligation, and I had gathered my courage and spoken before I could lose my nerve. He had looked at me with something like surprise, as though he had forgotten I could speak, and then his expression had shuttered, closing me out completely. "I am not sad, Lady Eleanor," he had said, using my title like a wall between us. "I am simply occupied with matters that require my attention." And then he had left, and I had learned not to ask again. Now, standing in the garden with the scent of roses heavy in the air and the sound of the ball continuing without me, I understood that I had been a fool. I had spent 3 years making excuses for his coldness, telling myself that he was simply reserved, that given time he might warm to me, that our marriage might become something bearable, if not beautiful. But the truth was simpler and more brutal than I had wanted to accept. He did not love me because he loved someone else. He had always loved someone else, and that someone was Lady Vivienne Harcourt. I knew of her, of course. Everyone in society knew of Lady Vivienne. She was one of those women who seemed to exist at the center of every story, beautiful and charming and utterly confident in her place in the world. She was the daughter of an earl, well-connected and well-liked, and she had never married despite being nearly 30, which was unusual enough to inspire gossip. Some said she was too particular, that no man could meet her standards. Others whispered that she had given her heart away years ago and refused to settle for less than the love she had lost. Looking at my husband's face as he kissed her, I knew which story was true. I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me and knew without turning that it was him. The Duke moved with a particular heaviness, a weight that seemed to carry all the burdens of his title and his name. Part of me wanted to run, to disappear into the maze of hedges and avoid this conversation entirely. But I was still a duchess, still my father's daughter, and I had been raised to face difficult things with dignity, even when dignity was all I had left. I turned slowly, and in the moonlight I could see his face clearly. He was handsome in a severe way, all strong jaw and dark eyes, with hair that was always perfectly combed and clothing that was always perfectly pressed. He looked like a duke should look, commanding and untouchable. But tonight there was something different in his expression, something almost like fear. It made him look younger, more human, and I felt a traitorous flutter of sympathy before I crushed it down. I would not pity him, not now, not after what I had just witnessed. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was rough, as though he had been running or shouting, though I knew he had done neither. "I did not know you had seen." I lifted my chin, grateful for the darkness that hid the tears I could feel threatening. "Did you think I would not, Your Grace?" It was hardly a private moment. Half the ballroom was watching. He flinched, and I felt a small, bitter satisfaction at having pierced his armor, even slightly. That was unforgivable of me. I did not mean for it to happen. It was not planned. "That makes it worse somehow," I said quietly, surprised by how steady my voice sounded when everything inside me was shaking. If it had been planned, it would at least suggest some thought, some consideration of consequences. But this was impulse, which means it was real, which means all of this, our marriage, these 3 years, have been a lie. He took a step toward me, his hand half raised as though he might reach for me, but then he stopped, letting his arm fall back to his side. "No," he said firmly. "No, Eleanor, that is not true. This marriage is not a lie." "Then what is it?" I asked. And now I could hear the desperation creeping into my voice, the last gasp of hope before drowning. "Tell me, Alexander. Tell me why you married me if you love her. Tell me why you have kept me at arm's length all this time, treating me like a stranger in my own home. Tell me something, anything, that makes this bearable." I saw something crack in his expression, some wall beginning to crumble, and for a moment I thought, He might actually do it, might finally give me the truth I had been craving for 3 long years. But then he closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the walls were back up, higher and thicker than before. "I cannot," he said, and his voice was hollow. "Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But I swear to you, Eleanor, I have never wished you harm. Everything I have done to protect you." "Protect me from what?" I whispered. But even as I asked, I was not sure I wanted the answer. What could possibly be worse than this, than knowing I had given 3 years of my life to a man who loved another woman? "From the truth," he said simply, and then he turned and walked back toward the ballroom, his figure disappearing into the golden light spilling from the windows. I stood alone in the garden, surrounded by roses and shadows, and I knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. I did not return to the ballroom that night. I could not bear the thought of facing all those eyes, all those whispers, the pitying glances and barely concealed satisfaction of women who had always wondered why the Duke of Ravensmoor had chosen plain little Eleanor Ashford when he could have had anyone. Now they knew the answer, or thought they did. He had not chosen me at all. He had simply accepted the most convenient solution to my family's problems while keeping his heart carefully locked away, reserved for a woman who could never truly be his. Instead, I walked through the garden until my slippers were soaked with dew and my feet ached with cold. The summer night had turned cool, and I had not thought to bring a shawl, but I welcomed the discomfort. It gave me something to feel besides the hollow ache in my chest, something physical and immediate that I could understand. I walked until I reached the old stone bench near the back wall, hidden from the house by an overgrowth of climbing roses, and there I finally allowed myself to cry. I wept silently, the way I had learned to weep in these 3 years at Ravensmoor, swallowing my sobs so that no one would hear, pressing my hands against my mouth to muffle any sound that might escape. I cried for the girl I had been at 19, full of nervous hope and the fragile belief that perhaps this marriage might not be as terrible as she feared. I cried for the woman I had become, hollow and invisible, living in the margins of someone else's life. And I cried for the future I could see stretching ahead of me now, endless years of this same emptiness, this same careful pretense that everything was acceptable when nothing was acceptable at all. When the tears finally stopped, I felt emptied out, scraped clean, and strangely calm. There was a clarity that came with having your worst fears confirmed, a kind of bitter peace in knowing that you had not been imagining things, that your instincts had been right all along. The Duke did not love me. He had never loved me. And whatever his reasons for marrying me, whatever protection he claimed to be offering, it did not change the fundamental truth of my situation. I was trapped in a marriage with a man whose heart belonged to someone else, and there was no escape, no possibility of annulment or divorce, nothing but years and years of this same quiet suffering. I must have sat there for hours, because when I finally rose and made my way back to the house, the ballroom windows were dark and the carriages had all departed. The castle was silent, except for the usual night sounds, the settling of old stones and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. I slipped in through the servants' entrance, not wanting to encounter anyone, and made my way up the back stairs to my chambers. Sarah, my maid, was waiting for me, dozing in a chair by the fire. She startled awake when I entered, her eyes widening as she took in my disheveled appearance, my ruined slippers, my tear-stained face. "Oh, my lady," she breathed, rising quickly to help me. "Let me draw you a bath. You must be frozen." I nodded mutely, too exhausted to speak, and let her lead me to the dressing room. She worked efficiently, heating water and preparing the tub, adding lavender oil that filled the room with a soothing scent. When the bath was ready, she helped me out of my gown, a beautiful creation of silk and lace that I would probably never wear again, too tainted now by the memory of this night. I sank into the hot water and closed my eyes, feeling some of the coldness begin to leach from my bones. Sarah did not ask questions, for which I was grateful. She simply washed my hair with gentle hands, untangling the elaborate arrangement that had taken 2 hours to create that afternoon, rinsing away the pomade and pins until my hair hung loose and clean down my back. When I was done, she wrapped me in warm towels and helped me into my nightgown, then braided my hair in a simple plait. "Would you like me to stay with you, my lady?" she asked quietly, and I shook my head. "Thank you, Sarah. That will be all." She curtsied and left, and I was alone again in the vast emptiness of my bedchamber. I climbed into bed and stared at the canopy above me, watching shadows dance across the fabric as the fire burned low. Sleep seemed impossible, my mind racing with images of the kiss, with Alexander's face as he told me he could not explain, with the terrible certainty that my life had just irrevocably changed, even though nothing had actually changed at all. I must have slept eventually, because I woke to pale morning light filtering through the curtains and the sound of Sarah entering with my breakfast tray. She set it down on the table by the window and opened the drapes, letting in the gray dawn. It was raining, I saw, a steady summer rain that blurred the view of the sea and made the world look as melancholy as I felt. "The Duke has requested to see you in his study at 10 o'clock, my lady," Sarah said carefully, not quite meeting my eyes. "Shall I help you dress?" I nodded and rose from bed, moving through the morning routine like a woman in a dream. Sarah brought out one of my simpler day dresses, a dark blue muslin that made me look pale and serious, and arranged my hair in a modest knot at the nape of my neck. I ate a few bites of toast, drank some tea, and tried to prepare myself for whatever conversation was about to occur. At precisely 10 o'clock, I knocked on the door of Alexander's study. His voice called out for me to enter, and I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside. The study was a masculine room, all dark wood and leather, with shelves of books lining every wall and a massive desk positioned to face the window. Alexander stood with his back to me, looking out at the rain, his hands clasped behind him. "Eleanor," he said without turning, "thank you for coming. You requested my presence, Your Grace. I could hardly refuse." He turned then, and I saw that he looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his hair was slightly disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it. His cravat was crooked, and his waistcoat was not quite properly buttoned. These small signs of disorder were so unlike him that I felt a flutter of concern before I remembered that I had no obligation to worry about his well-being. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs by the fireplace. I remained standing. "I would prefer to stand, thank you. What did you wish to discuss?" He sighed, a long, exhausted sound, and moved to pour himself a drink from the decanter on his desk. It was barely past 10 in the morning, but I said nothing as he downed the amber liquid in one swallow. "Eleanor, I owe you more than an apology for last night. I owe you the truth. But the truth is complicated, and there are others involved whose secrets are not mine to tell." "Then do not tell me," I said coolly. "I have learned to live with your silences, Your Grace. I can continue to do so." "No," he said sharply, with more emotion than I had heard from him in 3 years. "No, you cannot, and I cannot continue to ask it of you. You deserve better than this, better than me, and I have been a coward for letting it go on this long." "Letting what go on? Our marriage?" I felt my hands begin to tremble and clasped them tightly together. "Are you suggesting we should separate?" "God, no," he said, and there was genuine alarm in his voice. "Eleanor? No. That is not what I mean. I only mean that I have been unfair to you, keeping you in the dark, treating you like a stranger when you are my wife and deserve my respect if nothing else." "You love her," I said flatly. "Lady Vivienne, you have always loved her. That much is obvious to anyone with eyes." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with such pain that I almost looked away. "Yes," he said simply, "I love her. I have loved her since I was 20 years old. But Eleanor, That love is impossible. It has always been impossible. And I married you knowing that I could never have her, that our connection was forever forbidden. Why? I demanded, feeling anger begin to burn through the numbness. Why is it forbidden? She is not married. You were not married. What possible obstacle could have prevented you from being together? I cannot tell you that, he said, and I saw his jaw clench. Not without betraying a confidence that is not mine to break. But I swear to you, Eleanor, if there had been any way, any possible path to a life with Vivienne, I would have taken it. Instead, I married you because I needed to marry someone, because my duty to my family required an heir, and because your father needed help that I could provide. So I was convenient, I said bitterly. A transaction, a solution to multiple problems. You were more than that, he said quietly. You were innocent. You were kind. You came to this marriage with no expectations of love, only a hope that we might find some measure of companionship and respect. And I failed you even in that. I kept you at a distance because I could not bear to let you close, could not risk you discovering truths that would destroy more than just our marriage. What truths? I was almost shouting now, my composure finally cracking. What is so terrible that you cannot speak of it? What secret is worth 3 years of loneliness and humiliation? There are things in this world, Eleanor, that once known cannot be unknown. There are revelations that would shatter everything you believe about your own family, your own history. I have kept silent to protect you from that pain. I felt cold suddenly, despite the fire burning in the grate. My family? What does my family have to do with Lady Vivienne Harcourt? He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with some internal battle. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was so low I had to lean forward to hear him. Your father had a liaison many years ago, before he married your mother, with a French woman he met in Paris. That liaison produced a child. I stared at him, not understanding. My father had many liaisons. It is hardly a secret that he was unfaithful to my mother. This child was a daughter, Alexander continued, and his eyes never left my face. A daughter he abandoned when he returned to England. A daughter who was raised by her mother in poverty until the mother's death when the girl was 15. A daughter who was then brought to England by a distant relative and introduced into society under an assumed name and a fabricated history. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear my own thoughts. Who? I whispered. Who is this daughter? Lady Vivienne Harcourt is your half-sister, Eleanor, and I have known this since before we married. The room seemed to tilt around me. I reached out blindly and found the back of a chair, gripping it to keep myself upright. No, I said. No, that is impossible. My father would have told me. Vivienne would have said something. Your father does not know, Alexander said. He abandoned Vivienne's mother so completely that he never learned of her death, never knew that his daughter had survived and come to England. And Vivienne only discovered the truth herself 2 years ago, when she found letters her mother had kept, letters that proved her parentage beyond doubt. And you? I asked, my voice shaking. How did you learn of this? Vivienne told me, he said simply. We had been in love for months by then, talking of marriage, planning a future together. And then she received those letters from her mother's belongings, and everything changed. She came to me in tears, showed me the proof, and we both understood in that moment that we could never be together. Marriage between half-siblings, even unknown ones, would be not just scandalous, but illegal, immoral, impossible. So you married me instead, I said numbly, to protect her secret, to protect my father's reputation, to keep anyone from discovering the truth. I married you because I needed a wife and could not have the woman I loved. I married you because your family needed help and I could provide it. But yes, I also married you because I believed that by making you a duchess, by elevating your family's standing, I could ensure that if the truth ever came out, You would be protected by my name and my position. I thought I was doing the right thing, Eleanor. I thought I could keep everyone safe. Instead, you have kept me in a prison, I said, and I heard my voice break. You have made me complicit in a lie I did not know I was telling. You have stolen 3 years of my life while you pined after a woman who is my sister, my blood, and you never thought I deserved to know the truth. I did not know how to tell you, he said, and for the first time I heard genuine remorse in his voice. How do you tell someone that their father is not who they thought, that the woman their husband loves is their own sister? I thought silence was kinder. I was wrong. I turned away from him, needing to move, needing to do something with the terrible energy coursing through my body. I walked to the window and stared out at the rain, watching it blur and distort the world beyond the glass. I have a sister, I said, wonderingly. All this time, I have had a sister I did not know existed. And she knows. She has known and said nothing. She has watched me at balls and dinners, has smiled at me and made polite conversation, all while knowing that we share blood. She wanted to tell you, Alexander said, many times. But I convinced her to wait, to let me find the right moment, the right words. And then months became years, and the right moment never came. I turned to face him again, and I felt something hardening inside me, something cold and determined. I want to speak with her, I said. I want to hear this from her own lips. You have lied to me by omission for 3 years, Your Grace. I will not simply accept your word now. He nodded slowly. I will arrange it. She is staying in London for the season. I can send word today if you wish. I wish it, I said firmly. And until then, I would prefer that we maintain the same distance we have always kept. Do not attempt to apologize further. Do not try to explain or justify. You have made your choices, and now I must decide what I will do with this terrible knowledge you have finally given me. I left the study before he could respond, walking quickly down the corridor and up the stairs to my rooms. Once inside, I locked the door and sat down heavily on the bed, my mind spinning with everything I had just learned. I had a sister, Vivienne Harcourt, beautiful and confident Vivienne, was my father's daughter, my own blood. And the man I had married, the cold, distant Duke who had never touched me with anything resembling affection, had loved her desperately for years. I thought of all the times I had seen them together at various social occasions, the way they had carefully avoided too much conversation, the way Vivienne's eyes would follow Alexander across a room before she caught herself and looked away. I had thought it was simply attraction, the kind of pull between two beautiful people who could never quite forget each other. I had not known that beneath that careful distance lay a tragedy, a love made impossible by blood and circumstance. And the kiss last night, that terrible, wonderful kiss that had broken my heart. What had driven Alexander to abandon all his careful control, to risk everything in that one moment of weakness? Had it been the champagne, the music, the moonlight? Or had it simply been too many years of denying what he felt, too many years of pretending that duty was enough to sustain a person? I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, feeling lost and unmoored in a way I had never experienced before. Everything I thought I knew about my life had been revealed as false or incomplete. My father, whom I had always seen as flawed but fundamentally honest, had abandoned a child in a foreign country. My husband, whom I had thought simply cold and indifferent, was a man capable of great love who had sacrificed his own happiness to protect a secret that was not his own. And I, whom I had always believed to be alone in the world except for my parents and Margaret, had a sister who had been hiding in plain sight all along. The question now was what I would do with this knowledge. Could I forgive Alexander for his silence, his distance, his years of careful coldness that I now understood had been self-protection as much as cruelty? Could I accept Vivienne as my sister? Build some kind of relationship with her, despite the impossible tangle of emotions that bound us together? And most importantly, Could I continue to live in this marriage, knowing that I would always be second choice, the practical solution rather than the desired one, the wife he had settled for when he could not have the woman he truly wanted? I did not have answers to any of these questions. All I knew was that the life I had been living, the careful pretense of contentment, was no longer possible. The truth had finally emerged, and now I would have to decide who I wanted to be in light of it. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by a servant in unmarked livery who waited for no reply. I recognized Vivienne's handwriting immediately, that elegant flowing script I had seen on countless invitations and calling cards over the years. My hands trembled as I broke the seal, and I had to read the first lines twice before their meaning penetrated the fog of anxiety that had surrounded me since my conversation with Alexander. She would receive me that afternoon at 3 o'clock, at her residence in Mayfair. She asked that I come alone, without servants or companion, and she promised to explain everything, to answer any question I might have, no matter how painful. The letter was brief and formal, but I could sense the emotion beneath the careful words, the tremor of fear or hope, or both, that made certain letters slightly uneven, certain words pressed harder into the paper than others. I dressed with care, choosing a simple walking dress of dove gray that made me look older and more serious than my 22 years. I wanted to appear composed, dignified, not the naive girl who had stumbled through 3 years of marriage without understanding the most basic truths of her own situation. Sarah arranged my hair in a severe style, pulling it back from my face so that there was nowhere to hide, and I studied myself in the mirror with a critical eye. I looked pale and determined, my eyes shadowed from 3 nights of poor sleep, but there was a strength in my expression that had not been there before. Suffering, I was discovering, could hollow you out, or it could forge you into something harder and more resilient. I was determined to be the latter. The journey to London took most of the morning, the carriage rattling over country roads still muddy from recent rain. Alexander had offered to accompany me, but I had refused. This conversation needed to happen between Vivienne and myself, without his presence complicating an already impossible situation. He had looked relieved when I declined, and I wondered if he was afraid of what might be said, what accusations might be leveled, what emotions might finally be released after years of careful containment. London was loud and crowded after the isolation of Ravensmoor, and I felt overwhelmed by the press of carriages and pedestrians, the street vendors calling their wares, the smell of coal smoke and horses, and humanity packed too closely together. I had never much liked the city, preferring the quiet of the countryside, but today I was grateful for the noise and chaos. It gave me something to focus on besides the anxious churning in my stomach. Vivienne's residence was a neat townhouse on a quiet street, smaller than I had expected, but tastefully maintained. The door was answered by an older woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Booth, the housekeeper, and who led me up a narrow staircase to a sitting room on the first floor. "Lady Harcourt will be with you momentarily," she said, and left me alone in a room that was surprisingly simple and comfortable, with none of the ostentation I had associated with Vivienne's public persona. I walked slowly around the room, examining the details that might tell me something about the woman I was about to face. The furniture was good quality, but not extravagant, chosen for comfort rather than display. There were books everywhere, stacked on tables and shelves, many of them in French. A writing desk near the window held neat piles of correspondence and what looked like account books, suggesting a woman who managed her own affairs rather than leaving everything to solicitors and men of business. On the mantelpiece were a few small watercolors of French landscapes, painted with an amateur's enthusiasm but genuine skill. And I wondered if Vivienne had created them herself, if she had some memory of the country where she was born. The door opened behind me, and I turned to see her enter. Vivienne Harcourt, the woman my husband loved, the sister I had never known I had. She looked different than she had at the ball, smaller somehow, stripped of the confidence that usually surrounded her like armor. She wore a simple dress of pale yellow muslin, and her blonde hair was arranged loosely, with none of the elaborate styling I associated with her public appearances. Without the protective coloring of society, she looked younger and more vulnerable, and I could see now what I had never noticed before, the subtle similarities between us. We had the same shaped eyes, the same small hands, the same way of holding our heads slightly tilted when we were uncertain. "Eleanor," she said quietly, and her voice was hoarse, as though she had been crying or shouting or both. "Thank you for coming. I was not sure you would. Where else would I go?" I said, and I was surprised by how calm I sounded. "You have answers I need. My husband has told me things that have turned my entire life upside down, and I require the truth from someone who was actually there, who actually lived through this impossible situation." She nodded and gestured to the chairs near the fireplace. "Please sit. May I offer you tea? Something stronger?" "Tea would be welcome," I said, and she pulled a bell cord. We sat in strained silence until Mrs. Booth arrived with a tray, arranged the tea things, and departed. Vivienne poured with shaking hands, and I noticed that she added sugar to her cup the same way I did, 3 lumps and a splash of milk, and I felt a strange pang at this small evidence of our shared blood. "I do not know where to begin," Vivienne said finally, cradling her cup as though seeking warmth. "There is so much to explain, so many years of deception and silence. I hardly know which thread to pull first." "Begin with the truth," I said firmly. "My husband has told me that you are my father's daughter, that you were born in Paris to a Frenchwoman he abandoned, that you only learned of this connection 2 years ago. Is that accurate?" "Yes," she said softly. "All of it is true, though the bare facts cannot capture the complexity of how it felt to discover such a thing. My mother raised me alone, Eleanor. She worked as a seamstress, and we lived in a tiny apartment near the Marais. She never told me who my father was, only that he was an English gentleman who had promised to take care of us and then disappeared. She kept his letters, though, hidden in a box under her bed. Letters where he called her his beloved, where he promised to return for her, where he swore that their love was the truest thing he had ever known. And then he simply left," I said bitterly. "Returned to England and married my mother and never looked back." "I believe he thought my mother had chosen to stay in France," Vivienne said, and there was no anger in her voice, only a terrible sadness. The letters stopped coming, and she assumed he had forgotten her, moved on with his life. She never knew that he had tried to send for her, that his family had intercepted the correspondence, that by the time he returned to Paris to find her, we had moved to a different address, and he had no way to trace us. "How do you know this?" I asked sharply. "How can you possibly know what he intended if he never came back?" "Because I found letters from his mother to him, among the papers at your family estate. Letters that made it clear she had deliberately sabotaged his relationship with my mother, seeing it as a youthful infatuation that would damage his prospects. Your grandmother, Eleanor, ensured that my mother and I would be forgotten." I felt sick, thinking of my grandmother, the stern woman who had died when I was 12, who had always impressed upon me the importance of duty and proper behavior and maintaining the family name. Had she really been capable of such cruelty, of destroying a love and abandoning a child to poverty? "My mother died when I was 15, Vivienne continued, her voice catching slightly. "Consumption. She wasted away over the course of a year, and there was nothing I could do but watch and try to make her comfortable. Before she died, she gave me the box of letters, told me that my father was an English viscount, and made me promise that I would try to build a better life than she had been able to give me." "How did you come to England?" I asked. "How did you become Lady Vivienne Harcourt instead of whoever you really are?" "My mother had a cousin, distant but kind, who had married an English merchant and settled in Kent. She took me in after my mother's death, and her husband, who had always wanted children but never had any, treated me as his own daughter. When he died 3 years later, he left me a modest inheritance and a letter of introduction to Lord Harcourt, an old business associate who owed him several favors. Lord Harcourt agreed to sponsor me in society, to present me as a distant relation who had been orphaned and needed a proper launch. The story was believable enough, common enough, and I was young and pretty enough that no one questioned it too closely. "So Lady Vivienne Harcourt is a fiction," I said slowly, "an invention designed to help you enter a world that would have rejected you if they knew the truth." "Yes," she said simply. "I am not proud of the deception, but I saw no other choice. I had no money, no family, no prospects. In France, I would have ended up in a factory or worse. Here, I had a chance at a real life, at security and respect, and perhaps even happiness. And then you met Alexander." She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "And then I met Alexander, and for the first time since my mother died, I felt like I might actually be happy. He was kind to me, Eleanor. Not in the performative way that men are kind to pretty women they want to impress, but genuinely kind, as though he saw past the surface to the lonely girl underneath. We talked for hours about books and politics and philosophy. He made me laugh. He made me feel safe. And yes, I fell in love with him, desperately and completely." "When did you discover the truth about your parentage?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. 2 years ago," she said. "I had been seeing Alexander for 6 months by then, and we had begun to talk seriously about marriage. He had not yet proposed, but I knew it was coming, could feel it in the way he looked at me, the plans he made that always included a future together. And then, one afternoon, I was going through some old papers my mother's cousin had kept, looking for documents I needed to settle the last of her husband's estate, and I found a packet of letters addressed to my mother. Letters from your father, written before I was born, before he returned to England. Letters that made everything clear. I remembered the feeling of discovering Alexander's betrayal at the ball, the way the world had tilted and reformed itself into something unrecognizable, and I felt a reluctant sympathy for what Vivienne must have experienced. "What did you do?" "I went to Alexander immediately," she said. I was hysterical, barely coherent. I showed him the letters, the dates, the details that made it impossible to deny. We sat in his library, the same room where you spoke with him 3 days ago, and we both understood in the same terrible moment that everything we had hoped for was impossible. We were not just in love. We were half-siblings. Our marriage would be illegal, immoral, an abomination in the eyes of God and society. "And so he sent you away," I said. "No," she said firmly. "I left on my own." I could not bear to be near him, knowing what I knew, feeling what I felt. I took rooms in Bath and stayed there for 3 months, trying to decide what to do with my life. Alexander wrote to me every week, begging me to return to London, promising that we would find a way to remain in each other's lives even if we could not marry. But I could not face him, could not trust myself not to do something foolish and destructive. "When did you return?" 6 months before Alexander married you. I came back because I had nowhere else to go, because my money was running low, because I could not hide forever. Alexander came to see me the day after I arrived, and we had a long, terrible conversation about what we would do. We agreed that we could not simply disappear from each other's lives, that the connection between us was too strong to sever completely. But we also agreed that we would never act on our feelings, never cross the line from friendship into something more dangerous. "But you did cross that line," I said quietly. "I saw you kiss him at the ball." She flinched as though I had struck her. That was my fault, my weakness. Alexander had just told me that he was going to propose to you, that he had decided it was time to marry and produce an heir, and that you were the logical choice given your family's need and his own responsibilities. I was devastated, even though I had always known this day would come. And when I saw him at the ball, looking so handsome and so sad, I could not help myself. I wanted one last moment, one last memory of what we could never have. I kissed him, Eleanor. He did not initiate it. He tried to stop me. But in the end, he kissed me back, and I am sorry for that. Sorrier than I can possibly express. I set down my teacup, afraid I might drop it. Did you know he was going to marry me specifically? Did you know that I was your sister? No, she said, and her voice broke. God, no. I knew of your family, of course. Everyone in society knew that Viscount Ashford was in financial difficulty. But I did not know your father's first name, did not connect him to the man in my mother's letters. It was not until after the wedding, when I saw your father at the reception and heard him introduced with his full title and name, that I understood. And then I looked at you, really looked at you for the first time, and I saw the resemblance, the eyes, the hands, the way you held yourself. I saw myself in you, Eleanor, and I thought I might be sick right there in the receiving line. Why did you not tell me then? I demanded. Why did you let me go on thinking I was alone in this world, that I had no family besides my parents and Margaret? Why did you let me suffer through 3 years of isolation and loneliness when I had a sister who understood better than anyone what it meant to be lost and alone? Because I was a coward, she said simply, and tears were streaming down her face now. Because I did not know how to tell you without destroying everything, without exposing secrets that would hurt so many people. Your father does not know I exist, Eleanor. Your mother does not know. If the truth came out, the scandal would be ruinous. Your family would be shunned. Your sister Margaret would never make a good marriage. And you would be forever marked as the Duchess whose father had an illegitimate child, whose husband married her out of pity and convenience. I stood abruptly and walked to the window, needing to put space between us. Below, the street was quiet in the afternoon lull, a few servants hurrying past on errands, a dog nosing through refuse near the corner. The world continued on, indifferent to the drama unfolding in this small sitting room. I do not know if I can forgive this, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Not the circumstances of your birth, which you could not control. Not even the love between you and Alexander, which I understand was real and painful and impossible. But the silence, the years of deception, the way both of you decided what I should and should not know about my own life. That feels like a betrayal I am not sure I can move past. I understand, Vivienne said quietly. I do not expect your forgiveness, Eleanor. I do not deserve it. I only hope that someday you might be able to see me as I am, not as the woman who destroyed your marriage, but as someone who has been trying desperately to survive in a world that was never designed for people like me. I am your sister, whether we acknowledge it or not. We share blood and history, and a father who failed us both in different ways. That has to count for something. I turned to face her, and I saw in her expression the same exhaustion I felt in my own bones. We were both so tired of pretending and hiding and carrying secrets that were too heavy for anyone to bear alone. Perhaps we are not so different after all, I said slowly. You have been playing a role, being Lady Vivienne, when you are really just a frightened girl trying to build a life from nothing. And I have been playing the Duchess, pretending to be content when I was dying inside. We are both performers in a world that demands perfect performances. Yes, she said softly. Yes, that is exactly right. I have a question, I said, and my voice hardened slightly. Do you still love him? Do you still love my husband? She was quiet for a long moment, and I appreciated that she did not try to lie or soften the truth. Yes, she said finally. I love him. I will probably always love him. But Eleanor, I swear to you, I will never act on that love again. What happened at the ball was a moment of weakness, a terrible mistake that I regret with every fiber of my being. I will leave London if you wish. I will disappear from both your lives entirely. Whatever you need me to do to make this bearable, I will do it. I do not want you to disappear, I said, surprising myself. I want to know you. I want to understand who you are, who my sister is. But I also need time, Vivienne. Time to process all of this. Time to decide what kind of relationship we can have, if any. Time to figure out what I am going to do about my marriage." "Of course," she said quickly. "Take all the time you need. I am not going anywhere." I gathered my things and moved toward the door, but before I left, I turned back one last time. "Does he know you still love him?" She nodded slowly. "Yes. And he loves me too, Eleanor. I am sorry to tell you that, but you deserve honesty now after so many lies. He loves me, but he chose you. He chose duty and protection and doing what he believed was right. That should count for something." "Perhaps it should," I said. "But right now, I am not sure what anything counts for anymore." I left her townhouse and climbed back into the carriage, and as we rolled through the London streets toward the inn where I would stay the night before returning to Ravensmoor, I let myself cry again. But these tears were different from the ones I had shed in the garden 3 nights ago. These were not tears of shock or betrayal, but tears of grief for the innocence I had lost, for the simple life I had thought I was living before the truth shattered everything. I grieved for the girl I had been, and I grieved for the women Vivienne and I might have been if circumstances had been different. If our father had been a better man. If love had been enough to overcome the obstacles of blood and duty and social expectation. But grief, I was learning, was not the same as defeat. And as the carriage carried me through the fading light, I began to think about what I wanted, what I needed, what I would demand from this life that had been shaped by so many other people's decisions. I had been passive for too long, accepting what was given to me without question or complaint. But I was the Duchess of Ravensmoor, and I had more power than I had ever allowed myself to use. It was time to decide what kind of Duchess I would be, and what kind of life I would build from the ruins of the one I had thought I was living. I returned to Ravensmoor the following afternoon, and the castle had never looked more forbidding. The grey stone walls seemed to rise from the cliffs like a monument to duty and suffering, and as the carriage rolled up the long drive, I felt a familiar heaviness settle over me. This was my home, whether I wanted it to be or not, and within those walls was a husband I no longer knew how to think about, a man who had married me to protect a secret while loving someone else. Alexander was waiting for me in the entrance hall when I arrived. He looked haggard, as though he had not slept since I left, and his eyes searched my face with an anxiety I had never seen in him before. "How did it go?" he asked quietly. "Did she tell you everything?" "She told me enough," I said, removing my gloves and handing them to the footman. "We need to talk, Your Grace, but not here, not where servants can overhear. Your study, in an hour." He nodded and stepped back, allowing me to pass. I went directly to my chambers, where Sarah was waiting with a basin of warm water and fresh tea. She asked no questions, simply helped me change from my traveling clothes into a simple afternoon dress and arranged my hair into something less severe. I could see the concern in her eyes, but I was grateful for her discretion. I needed time to gather my thoughts before facing Alexander, time to decide what I would say and what I would demand. When the hour had passed, I made my way to the study and found him standing by the window, staring out at the sea. He turned when I entered, and I saw in his expression a vulnerability that was almost painful to witness. He looked like a man waiting for judgment, for the verdict that would determine the rest of his life. "I spoke with Vivienne," I began, closing the door behind me and moving to stand near the fireplace. "She confirmed everything you told me and filled in details you omitted. I now understand why you married me, why you have kept me at such careful distance, why you looked at her the way you did at the ball. I understand the impossible situation you found yourself in, and I even understand why you chose silence over truth." "Eleanor," he started, but I held up my hand. "I am not finished. I understand all of this intellectually, but understanding does not make it hurt less. You have stolen 3 years from me, Alexander. 3 years where I believed myself to be unworthy of love, too plain or too dull or too something to inspire even basic affection in my own husband. 3 years where I watched other couples at balls and dinners, couples who might not love each other passionately but at least seemed to enjoy each other's company, and I wondered what was so fundamentally wrong with me that my own husband could barely stand to be in the same room. "I never thought you were unworthy," he said, his voice rough. "God, Eleanor, that was never the issue. You are intelligent and kind and far stronger than you give yourself credit for. If I could have loved anyone, it would have been you. But you could not love me because you already loved someone else," I said flatly. "Because Vivienne has had your heart since you were 20 years old. And discovering that she was my sister did not change that, did not make you suddenly able to transfer those feelings to me." "No," he admitted, "it did not. And I am sorry for that, sorrier than I can express. But Eleanor, I did try to be a good husband to you in other ways. I provided for you, protected you, ensured that you wanted for nothing material. I gave you freedom to pursue your own interests, never curtailed your movements or demanded things of you that would have made you uncomfortable. You gave me everything except yourself," I said, and I heard the bitterness in my own voice. "You gave me a title and a home and complete isolation, and you expected me to be grateful for it." He flinched as though I had struck him. "You are right. You are absolutely right, and I have no defense except that I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. I thought that by marrying you, I could give your family the help they needed while providing Vivienne with cover, with a reason why we could never be together that would not expose her secret. I thought I could manage my own feelings, keep them locked away where they would not hurt anyone. I was wrong." I walked to the window and stood beside him, looking out at the turbulent sea. The waves crashed against the cliffs with relentless force, and I thought about how water could wear down even the hardest stone given enough time. Perhaps that was what these 3 years had been, a slow erosion of the person I had been until I was shaped into something different, something harder and more resilient. Vivienne asked me if I wanted her to leave London, to disappear from our lives entirely. I told her no. I told her I wanted to know my sister, wanted to build some kind of relationship with her despite the impossible circumstances. "But I need to know, Alexander. Can you accept that? Can you accept me having a relationship with the woman you love, seeing her regularly, speaking of her in your presence?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with the question. Finally he spoke, and his voice was careful, measured. "If that is what you need, then yes, I will not stand in your way. But Eleanor, I need you to understand something. My feelings for Vivienne, they are not going to simply disappear because you know about them now. I will always love her. But I am committed to this marriage, to honoring the vows I made to you. I will never act on those feelings again. What happened at the ball was a moment of weakness that I deeply regret, but it will not happen again." "How can you promise that?" I asked, turning to face him. "How can you promise to control something as uncontrollable as love?" "Because I have been doing it for 3 years," he said simply. "Because I am capable of choosing duty over desire, responsibility over happiness. Because despite what you may think of me, I do have honor, and I will not dishonor you again by pursuing something that can never be." I studied his face, looking for signs of deception or self-delusion, but I saw only grim determination. He meant what he said, I realized. He genuinely believed he could spend the rest of his life married to me while loving someone else, maintaining perfect control over his emotions and his actions. It was both admirable and deeply sad, this commitment to suffering for the sake of propriety. "I have been thinking about what I want," I said slowly. "What I need from this marriage if it is to continue, and I have come to some conclusions that you may find difficult to accept." "Tell me," he said. "Whatever you need, if it is within my power to give it, I will. First, I want honesty between us from now on. Complete honesty. No more secrets, no more careful omissions, no more protecting me from truths you think I cannot handle. If something concerns our marriage, or our family, or anything that affects our lives, I want to know about it." He nodded immediately. "Agreed. You have my word. Second, I want us to actually be married. Not in the legal sense, we already are, but in the practical sense. I want us to have dinner together regularly. I want us to talk about our days, our thoughts, our plans. I want us to ride together, walk together, be seen together as an actual couple rather than two strangers who happen to live in the same house. I am tired of being invisible, Alexander. I am tired of living like a ghost in my own home." I could see the surprise in his expression, and something else too, something that might have been relief. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, I would like that very much. I have missed having someone to talk to, someone who might actually care about the minutiae of estate management, or the books I am reading, or the things that occupy my thoughts. Third," I said, and my voice was harder now, "I want you to acknowledge publicly that I am your wife and that you value me. Not love me, I am not asking for that, but value me, respect me, treat me with the consideration you would show any partner in an important endeavor. No more standing apart at social functions while you watch Vivienne from across the room. No more making me feel like an inconvenient obligation you must endure." His jaw tightened, but he nodded. "You are right. I have been careless with your dignity, and that was unforgivable. It will not happen again." "And fourth," I said, taking a deep breath before continuing, "I want us to try to have a child. Not immediately, not until we have rebuilt some kind of foundation between us, but eventually. You married me for an heir, and I married you accepting that children would be part of our arrangement. I want to be a mother, Alexander. I want to have someone to love who might actually love me back without reservation or complication." He was very still, and I could not read his expression. "A child," he said carefully. "You would want to bring a child into this marriage, knowing what you know now about my feelings for Vivienne. I would want to bring a child into a marriage where both parents are committed to making it work, where both parents understand the reality of their situation and are choosing to build something meaningful despite it. Yes, because the alternative is spending the next 40 years in this same state of suspension, neither truly married nor truly separate, neither happy nor utterly miserable, just existing in a kind of gray limbo, and I refuse to accept that as my future." He reached out then, slowly, and took my hand. It was the first time he had touched me voluntarily in 3 years, and I felt a shock run through me at the contact. His hand was warm and strong, and he held mine gently, as though afraid I might pull away. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion, "I do not deserve your willingness to try. I do not deserve your strength or your forgiveness or your commitment to making this marriage work. But I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of them. I will be the husband you deserve, even if I cannot be the husband you dreamed of." "I did not dream of any particular husband," I said quietly. "I dreamed of being seen, of mattering to someone, of building a life that felt meaningful and real. Help me do that, Alexander. Help me create something from this impossible situation we find ourselves in. It will not be the marriage either of us imagined, but perhaps it can still be something good." We stood there by the window, hands clasped, looking out at the restless sea, and I felt something shift between us. It was not love, not yet, perhaps not ever. But it was understanding, and it was respect, and it was the beginning of something that might, with time and effort and painful honesty, become a real partnership. Over the next few weeks, we began to rebuild our marriage from the ground up. We started having dinner together every evening, sitting across from each other at the small table in the family dining room, rather than the vast formal table where we had taken our wedding breakfast 3 years earlier. At first, the conversations were stilted and careful, both of us uncertain of how to speak to each other without the protective distance we had maintained for so long. But gradually, we found our rhythm. Alexander told me about the estate, about problems with tenants and decisions about crop rotation and plans for improving drainage on the north fields. I told him about the books I was reading, about my watercolors, about letters from Margaret, who was preparing for her first real season in London. We discovered that we had more in common than either of us had realized. We both loved poetry, particularly the metaphysical poets, and we would sometimes read to each other after dinner, debating interpretations of Donne and Herbert. We both enjoyed chess, and we established a running game that we would play over the course of several evenings, moving pieces while we talked about other things. We both found the social season exhausting and preferred the quiet of the countryside, though we acknowledged that we would need to spend more time in London for appearances and for Margaret's sake. And slowly, carefully, we began to touch each other. Nothing intimate, not yet, but small gestures of affection and comfort. His hand on my shoulder as he passed my chair, my fingers brushing his as he handed me a book, a brief touch to my back as he guided me through a doorway. These small contacts felt momentous, each one a small bridge being built between two people who had existed as strangers for far too long. I also began to build a relationship with Vivienne. She came to visit Ravensmoor 6 weeks after our conversation in London, and I watched from the window as her carriage approached, feeling a complicated mix of anxiety and anticipation. Alexander excused himself when she arrived, understanding without being asked that we needed time alone, and I received her in the conservatory where the roses were in full bloom. We were awkward at first, both of us unsure of how to be sisters when we had spent so long being strangers who shared a terrible secret. But gradually, as we walked among the flowers and talked about inconsequential things, I began to see past the beautiful, confident woman everyone else saw to the person underneath. She was funny, I discovered, with a sharp wit and a tendency towards self-deprecation that was completely at odds with her public persona. She was well-read and politically engaged, following parliamentary debates with the kind of attention most women were taught to avoid. And she was kind, genuinely kind, in small ways that suggested this was her natural state rather than a performance. We talked about our childhoods, about what it had been like for her growing up in Paris with a mother who loved her but could give her so little, and what it had been like for me growing up in England with every material advantage but parents who were too absorbed in their own drama to pay much attention to their daughters. We discovered that we had both learned to make ourselves small, to not ask for too much, to be grateful for whatever scraps of affection came our way. We had both learned to perform, to present a carefully curated version of ourselves to the world, while hiding everything that was real and raw and vulnerable. And we talked about Alexander, carefully at first, but then with increasing honesty. She told me about falling in love with him, about the way he had made her feel safe for the first time since her mother died, about the terrible moment when she realized that everything she wanted was forbidden. I told her about my 3 years of loneliness, about the slow erosion of hope, about standing in the garden and watching them kiss and feeling my heart break. We cried together, mourning the loss of the lives we might have lived if circumstances had been different. But we also began to build something new. We wrote to each other regularly, long letters full of observations about books and society and the small domestic details of our lives. She came to visit monthly, and I began to travel to London more frequently, staying at her townhouse rather than the Ravensmoor residence in Mayfair. We were becoming friends as well as sisters, and I found in her the companionship I had been craving for years. Alexander watched this developing relationship with a combination of pain and relief. It hurt him, I knew, to see Vivienne and me together, to be constantly reminded of what he could not have. But he also seemed genuinely happy that I was no longer alone, that I had found in Vivienne something he could not give me. He was scrupulously careful when she visited, greeting her politely and then finding reasons to absent himself, giving us privacy while maintaining the boundaries we had all agreed to respect. 3 months after our conversation in his study, Alexander and I became husband and wife in truth. It was not passionate or romantic, but it was tender in its way, both of us careful with each other, aware of the fragility of what we were building. Afterward, lying beside him in the darkness, I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not love, not yet, but a kind of tentative affection, a sense that perhaps we might actually manage to build something meaningful from the wreckage of our first 3 years. And then, 2 months later, I discovered I was with child. The realization came gradually. A missed course followed by morning sickness and a strange metallic taste in my mouth that the doctor confirmed was a common symptom of early pregnancy. I sat in my chambers with the knowledge, turning it over in my mind, trying to understand what I felt. Fear, certainly. Anxiety about childbirth, about whether I would be a good mother, about bringing a child into such a complicated situation. But also something else, something that felt almost like joy. I would have someone to love, someone who was entirely mine, someone who would anchor me to this life I was trying to build. I told Alexander that evening after dinner, and I watched his face transform. For a moment, all the careful control fell away, and I saw naked hope and wonder in his expression. "A child," he said quietly, and his hand moved instinctively toward my still flat stomach before he caught himself. "May I?" I nodded, and he placed his palm gently against my abdomen, and I saw tears gathering in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for this gift, Eleanor. I will do everything in my power to be a good father, to be worthy of this second chance you are giving me." "We are both getting a second chance," I said softly. "Both of us. And we are going to make it work, Alexander, for this child and for ourselves. We are going to build something real from all this pain and complication. We are going to be a family." He pulled me into his arms then, holding me with a fierce tenderness, and I let myself rest against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my cheek. We stood there for a long time, neither of us speaking, both of us contemplating the future that was taking shape, the life that was growing inside me, the fragile hope that perhaps, against all odds, we might actually find a way to be happy. The child arrived on a cold March morning after 14 hours of labor that left me exhausted and shaking, but filled with a fierce joy I had never imagined possible. She was perfect, tiny and red-faced, and screaming with the outrage of someone who had been rudely ejected from comfort into a cold and uncertain world. The midwife placed her in my arms, and I looked down at her squinting eyes and her little fists waving in the air, and I felt something inside me crack open, some wall I had built around my heart finally crumbling under the weight of this overwhelming love. We named her Catherine, after Alexander's mother, and she became the center of our world from that first moment. Alexander was besotted with her in a way that would have been comical if it had not been so touching. He would sit for hours holding her, studying her tiny features as though searching for answers to questions he had never thought to ask. He sang to her in a low voice, old ballads his own mother had sung to him, and I would watch from the doorway and feel my heart swell with an emotion I was finally ready to name as love. It was not the passionate, consuming love that existed between Alexander and Vivienne, the kind of love that poets wrote about and that destroyed everything in its path. It was something quieter and steadier, built on shared experience and mutual respect, and the daily choice to be kind to each other, even when it was difficult. It was the love of two people who had been through darkness together and had chosen to walk toward light, however uncertain the path. Vivienne came to visit 3 weeks after Catherine's birth, and I watched as she held my daughter with trembling hands. Her eyes filled with tears. "She is beautiful, Eleanor," she whispered. "She looks like you." The same dark hair, the same serious expression. "She has Alexander's eyes," I said quietly, and we both knew what I was acknowledging. This child was a reminder of everything Vivienne could never have, the family she could never build with the man she loved. But she did not turn away or make excuses to leave. Instead, she sat with me in the nursery for hours, rocking Catherine and telling her stories about Paris, about the little apartment where she had lived with her mother, about the flowers that grew in the window boxes, and the way the light looked on summer evenings. "I am going to be the most devoted aunt in all of England," Vivienne declared, and I believed her. She visited regularly after that, bringing little gifts for Catherine and taking her turn walking the floors when the baby was fussy. She and Alexander maintained their careful distance, never touching, rarely speaking directly to each other, but I could see the pain in both their faces when they thought no one was looking. They had sacrificed so much for propriety and duty, and now they had to watch each other from across unbridgeable distances while I held the child that should have been theirs. I felt guilty about that sometimes, guilty for having what they wanted, guilty for the happiness that grew between Alexander and me while they remained trapped in their impossible love. But I was also learning that life was complicated, that joy and sorrow could exist simultaneously, that it was possible to be grateful for your own blessings while mourning what others had lost. When Catherine was 6 months old, we received word that my father was gravely ill. The consumption that had claimed so many in his dissipated lifestyle had finally caught up with him, and the doctors gave him only weeks to live. Alexander and I traveled to my family's estate with Catherine, and I prepared myself to face the man whose choices had shaped so many lives, who had abandoned a child in Paris and never looked back. He was thin and gray when I entered his bedchamber, a shadow of the robust man who had once commanded every room he entered. My mother sat beside him, her face drawn with exhaustion and grief, and Margaret hovered near the window, looking frightened and young. They brightened when they saw Catherine, and my mother reached for her with trembling hands, cooing over her granddaughter with genuine delight. But it was my father I needed to speak with, and after my mother and Margaret had left us alone, I sat beside his bed and looked at the man who had inadvertently connected all our fates. He studied me with eyes that were still sharp despite his illness, and I saw in his expression a kind of knowing that made me wonder if he had already guessed what I had come to say. "There are things you need to know," I began quietly, "things that have been kept from you for years, but that you deserve to understand before you die." He listened without interruption as I told him about Vivienne, about the daughter he had never known existed, about the woman she had become despite his abandonment. I told him about Alexander's love for her, about the impossible situation we had all found ourselves in, about the secrets and silences that had shaped our lives. I did not spare him or myself, laying out the truth with a clarity that felt both cruel and necessary. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then slowly he spoke, and his voice was hoarse with more than just illness. "I knew her mother was with child when I left Paris. My mother told me, showed me a letter that had arrived after I returned to England. But she convinced me that the child had died, that there was nothing I could do, that I had responsibilities here that mattered more than a French seamstress and her bastard. But you never went back to check," I said, and I heard the accusation in my own voice. "You never tried to find them, to see if the letter was true. You just accepted what was convenient and moved on with your life." "Yes," he said simply. "I was young and selfish and afraid of what my family would do if I defied them. So I took the coward's way out, and I have regretted it every day since. Your mother was a good woman, Eleanor, and she deserved better than a husband who married her while still in love with someone else. And you and Margaret deserved better than a father who was always looking backward, always wondering what might have been." "You have another daughter," I said quietly. "She is called Vivienne Harcourt, and she is extraordinary. She is intelligent and kind and stronger than anyone I have ever met. She survived poverty and loss and built a life for herself from nothing. And she deserves to know that her father acknowledges her, that she was not simply a mistake to be forgotten." "Bring her to me," he said, and there was urgency in his voice now. "Before I die, I want to meet her. I want to tell her I am sorry. I want to give her something, some acknowledgement of her place in this family." I wrote to Vivienne that same day, and she arrived within 48 hours, traveling through the night to reach us before it was too late. I met her at the door and led her up to my father's chamber, and I watched as they saw each other for the first time. He wept when she entered, holding out a shaking hand, and she took it without hesitation, sinking to her knees beside his bed. They spoke for hours, and I left them alone to have the conversation that was 29 years overdue. When Vivienne finally emerged, her eyes were red, but she looked lighter somehow, as though a burden she had carried her entire life had finally been lifted. "He apologized," she said quietly. "He told me about my mother, about how much he loved her, about how his cowardice cost them both everything. And he has changed his will. He is leaving me a portion of the estate, enough that I will never have to worry about money again. And he is acknowledging me as his daughter in a codicil that will be made public after his death. The scandal will be significant," I warned her. "Society will talk about nothing else for months." "Let them talk," she said, with a small smile. "I am tired of hiding, Eleanor. I am tired of pretending to be someone I am not. If I am to have a family, I want to claim it openly, whatever the consequences." My father died 3 days later, and the reading of his will caused exactly the scandal Vivienne had predicted. The revelation that Viscount Ashford had an illegitimate daughter, and that he had left her a substantial inheritance, shocked society and dominated gossip for the entire season. My mother retreated to the countryside in embarrassment, and Margaret's marriage prospects suffered temporarily as every potential suitor's family questioned whether they wanted to ally themselves with such scandal. But I stood by Vivienne publicly and unapologetically. I introduced her at social functions as my sister, invited her to every event Alexander and I hosted, and made it clear through word and deed that anyone who wished to insult her would find themselves at odds with the Duchess of Ravensmoor. Alexander supported me in this completely, using his influence to ensure that doors remained open to Vivienne despite the whispers. Gradually, the scandal faded, as scandals always do, replaced by new dramas and fresh gossip. Vivienne's inheritance gave her independence and security, and she began to build a new life for herself, one based on truth rather than carefully constructed fiction. She traveled to Paris and visited her mother's grave, finally able to mourn properly after so many years. She started a small charitable foundation to help young women who found themselves in circumstances similar to her mother's, providing them with education and opportunities that might prevent them from ending up destitute and alone. And she remained part of our lives, an integral presence in Catherine's childhood and eventually in the lives of the 2 sons who followed. She was Aunt Vivienne to our children, and they adored her, never knowing the complicated history that connected us all. She never married, and I sometimes wondered if she still carried a torch for Alexander. But if she did, she hid it well. Their interactions remained cordial and distant, 2 people bound by history and affection who had chosen to love each other from afar rather than destroy everything for a moment's passion. As for Alexander and me, we built a marriage that was solid if not passionate, affectionate if not romantic. We learned to read each other's moods and needs, to anticipate each other's thoughts, to work together as partners in the complicated business of running an estate and raising children and navigating society. We had our difficulties, moments when the ghost of what might have been would rise between us, moments when I would catch him looking at Vivienne with longing, or when I would lie awake at night wondering if he would have been happier with a different wife. But we also had moments of genuine connection and even joy. Quiet evenings in the library reading together while the children played nearby. Long walks through the gardens discussing everything from politics to philosophy. The fierce pride in each other's eyes as we watched our children grow and thrive. The comfort of familiar presence, of knowing that whatever challenges came, we would face them together. One evening, nearly 10 years after that terrible night at the ball, I found Alexander standing in Catherine's room watching her sleep. She was 9 years old by then, dark-haired and serious like me, but with his sharp intelligence and gift for observation. He turned when I entered, and in the dim light, I could see tears on his cheeks. "I have been thinking," he said quietly, "about the night you saw me kiss Vivienne, about how that moment changed everything, forced us all to confront truths we had been avoiding. And I realize now that as terrible as it was also necessary. We could not have built what we have now without first tearing down all the lies and pretense." I moved to stand beside him, and together we looked down at our sleeping daughter. "I hated you that night," I admitted. "I hated you with a passion I did not know I was capable of feeling. But I also understand now that you were trapped, that you were trying to protect everyone and ended up hurting everyone instead, yourself included. Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "This life we have built? Do you ever wish you had married someone who could have loved you the way I love Vivienne?" I considered the question carefully, wanting to give him an honest answer. "Sometimes," I said slowly. "Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like to be someone's first choice, their only choice. But then I look at our children, at this family we have created, at the way we have learned to be kind to each other even when it is difficult, and I think, perhaps, what we have is more valuable than passion. We have chosen each other every day, even when it would have been easier to give up. That kind of commitment, that kind of partnership, it is worth something, Alexander. It is worth a great deal." He took my hand, the gesture as natural now as it had once been foreign, and we stood together in the comfortable silence of two people who had earned each other's respect through years of effort and patience. "I will never be able to give you the grand romance you might have wanted," he said quietly, "but I can give you this life, this partnership, this family, and I can promise that I will choose you every day for the rest of our lives." "That is enough," I said, and I meant it. It had to be enough, because it was all we had, and sometimes the most profound love was not the kind that swept you away, but the kind that held you steady, day after day, year after year, through all the complicated messiness of being human. Years later, when I was an old woman and Alexander was long gone, taken by a fever in his 63rd year, I would sit with my grandchildren and tell them stories about their grandfather. I would tell them about his intelligence and his dedication to the estate and his workers, about his fierce love for his children, about the way he had taught them to think critically and question assumptions. I would tell them about the partnership we had built, about the respect and affection that had sustained us through decades of marriage. But I never told them about Vivienne, about the love he had carried his entire life for a woman he could never have. Some secrets were better left buried, some pain too private to share. It was enough that they knew their parents had cared for each other, had built something meaningful together, had created a family that was strong and loving despite its complicated origins. Vivienne lived until she was 78, and I was with her when she died, holding her hand just as she had held mine through so many difficult moments. In her last hours, she whispered his name, Alexander's name, and I knew that despite everything, despite the years and the distance and the life she had built for herself, she had never stopped loving him. And I forgave her for it, completely and finally, because I understood by then that love was not something you could control or command or turn off like a lamp. It simply was, for better or worse, and you could choose what to do with it, but you could not choose whether to feel it. "I am glad I had a sister," I told her as her breathing grew shallow. "I am glad we found each other, even in such terrible circumstances. You gave me something I did not know I needed, a connection that went deeper than the complications of our situation." She smiled weakly and squeezed my hand. "You gave me a family, Eleanor. You gave me a place to belong. That was the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." When she was gone, I stood at her grave next to Alexander's, two people I had loved in such different ways, two people whose choices had shaped my entire life. The Duke and the sister, bound together by an impossible love that had somehow, miraculously, created space for me to find my own kind of happiness. I thought about the girl I had been at 19, frightened and hopeful, walking into a marriage with no idea of the pain and growth that awaited her. I thought about the woman I had become, scarred by betrayal, but strengthened by survival, capable of building a life from the ruins of her dreams. And I thought about how love, real love, was so much more complicated than the novels made it seem, so much messier and more painful and more rewarding than I could ever have imagined. The truth had destroyed us, yes, but it had also saved us. It had forced us to see each other clearly, to make choices based on reality rather than fantasy, to build something authentic rather than living in comfortable delusion. And in the end, that authenticity, that hard-won honesty, had given me a life that was richer and more meaningful than any easy happiness could have been. I was the Duchess of Ravensmoor, and I had earned that title not through birth or beauty or charm, but through the simple, stubborn act of refusing to give up, of choosing to build something good from something broken, of learning that sometimes the greatest love stories are not about passion, but about persistence, not about finding the perfect person, but about becoming the right partner for the imperfect person you have been given. And as I stood between those two graves, with the wind coming off the sea and the sun breaking through the clouds to illuminate the gray stone of Ravensmoor in the distance, I felt something I had not expected to feel. Peace. Not happiness, exactly, but peace. The peace of a life fully lived, of challenges met and overcome, of love found in unexpected places. The peace of a woman who had started her story invisible and small, and had ended it strong and seen and loved, not perfectly but truly, by the people who mattered most. That was enough. It had to be enough. And somehow miraculously it was.